I was standing in the hallway of St. Mary's Medical Center, clutching a lukewarm cup of coffee that had gone cold in my hands hours ago, when I heard the words that would change everything. The fluorescent lights above me flickered intermittently, casting shadows that danced across the sterile white walls, and somewhere in the distance a monitor was beeping in that steady, relentless rhythm that hospitals seem to pulse with, the kind of sound that gets inside your head and stays there long after you've left. I had been there for nearly 18 hours straight, watching my mother slip in and out of consciousness after what the doctors called a routine procedure, though nothing about the way her body had rejected the anesthesia seemed routine to me, and I had spent most of that time pacing between her room and this exact spot where the vending machines hummed and occasionally swallowed dollar bills without giving anything in return. My mother had always been the kind of woman who wore her strength like armor, the type who raised 3 children mostly on her own after my father decided that his secretary and a condo in Florida were more appealing than the family he had built over 23 years of marriage, and she had worked double shifts at the textile factory until her hands were permanently stained with dye and her back had curved into a question mark that no amount of physical therapy could straighten. She never complained, not once, not even when the arthritis got so bad that opening a jar of pickles became an ordeal that required heating pads and determination, and she certainly never asked for help, which is probably why it took me so long to realize that the cough she had been dismissing for months was actually stage 3 lung cancer, the kind that had already spread to her lymph nodes by the time she finally agreed to see a doctor. The surgery was supposed to remove part of her left lung, give her a fighting chance at maybe 5 more years if we were lucky, and the oncologist had been cautiously optimistic in that way doctors are when they don't want to make promises but also don't want to crush all hope, so I had clung to that cautious optimism like a lifeline, telling myself that my mother was too stubborn to let something like cancer take her down without a fight. But then the complications started. Her blood pressure dropping during the procedure, her oxygen levels refusing to stabilize afterward, and suddenly the cautiously optimistic oncologist was being replaced by a rotating cast of specialists who spoke in hushed tones and avoided making direct eye contact with me when I asked questions about timelines and prognosis. I had called my brother Marcus 3 times that first day, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails that ranged from calm and informational to barely holding back tears, but he never called back, and when I finally reached him on the 4th attempt, he told me he was in the middle of closing a major deal at work and couldn't just drop everything because Mom had decided to get sick at an inconvenient time, which is exactly how he phrased it, as if she had scheduled her cancer around his quarterly earnings report. My sister Janet had been more sympathetic but equally absent, explaining that she had just started a new job in Seattle and couldn't afford to take time off during her probationary period, and besides, she was sure that I had everything under control because I always did, which was both a compliment and an accusation wrapped up in one guilt-inducing statement that made me want to scream into the phone until my voice gave out. So I was alone, keeping vigil beside a woman who had given me everything and asked for nothing in return, watching her chest rise and fall with the assistance of machines that beeped and hissed in a mechanical symphony that felt like the opposite of life. The nurses were kind but overworked, appearing every few hours to check vitals and adjust medications, their faces tired behind surgical masks that had become permanent fixtures in this post-pandemic world we were all still navigating, and they would offer me weak smiles and sometimes a hand on my shoulder. These small gestures of comfort from strangers who understood that hospitals were places where families fell apart as often as they came together. On the 3rd day, when my mother's condition had stabilized enough that she was moved from the ICU to a regular recovery room, I went home for the first time to shower and change clothes, my apartment feeling foreign and wrong after so many hours in that fluorescent-lit purgatory, and I stood under water so hot it turned my skin red, trying to wash away the smell of antiseptic and despair that seemed to have seeped into my pores. I slept for maybe 4 hours before anxiety jolted me awake, my brain conjuring worst-case scenarios in vivid detail, and I was back at the hospital before the sun had fully risen, clutching a bag with fresh clothes for my mother and a chocolate bar from the gas station that I had bought with a vague intention of eating but knew I wouldn't. That's when I saw Dr. Harrison for the first time, a man in his early 50s with silver hair and the kind of authoritative presence that suggested he was used to being the smartest person in any room, and he was standing outside my mother's room with 2 residents trailing behind him like ducklings, their white coats pristine compared to his which had coffee stains near the pocket and a pen mark on the sleeve. I approached them with my visitor badge still dangling from my jacket, ready to ask about my mother's latest test results and whether the antibiotics were working on the infection that had developed in her surgical site, but before I could open my mouth, I heard Dr. Harrison's voice carrying down the hallway in that particular tone medical professionals use when they think they're out of earshot of anyone who matters. He was saying that the patient in room 412, which was my mother's room, was a complicated case made worse by non-compliance and lack of family support, and one of the residents asked something I couldn't quite hear, to which Dr. Harrison responded that it was unfortunate when elderly patients ended up in the system without anyone to advocate for them. That these cases often resulted in poor outcomes not because of the medical care, but because there was no one to ensure follow-through on treatment plans and rehabilitation protocols. The other resident made a note on his tablet and commented that it was sad how many seniors ended up abandoned by their families, left to navigate the healthcare system alone, and Dr. Harrison nodded sagely, saying something about the importance of social support networks in recovery that I'm sure he had read in a medical journal somewhere, but clearly hadn't bothered to verify before making assumptions about my mother's situation. I felt something cold and sharp lodge itself in my chest, the sensation of being simultaneously invisible and hypervisible, and my hand started shaking so badly that I had to set down the bag I was carrying because I was afraid I might drop it. These doctors, these professionals who were supposed to be caring for my mother, had looked at her chart and seen an elderly woman with cancer and somehow concluded that she was alone, abandoned, without family, despite the fact that I had been there every single day, sleeping in an uncomfortable chair, asking questions, making sure she was comfortable, doing everything a daughter should do and then some. I wanted to march over there and tell them exactly how wrong they were, to list every hour I had spent by her bedside, every conversation with nurses, every time I had held my mother's hand while she cried from pain or fear or the overwhelming exhaustion of fighting a battle she hadn't asked for, but something stopped me. This voice in my head that sounded suspiciously like my mother's that said sometimes you learn more by staying quiet and listening than by immediately correcting people's mistakes. So I stood there, partially hidden by a pillar, and I listened as Dr. Harrison continued his rounds, moving from patient to patient with his entourage, dispensing wisdom and orders with equal measure of confidence. When they finally moved down to the next room, I walked into my mother's space and found her awake, her eyes clearer than they had been in days, and she smiled at me with that particular expression that mothers perfect over years of knowing their children better than anyone else ever will, and she asked me why I looked so upset. Was everything okay with work? Was I eating enough? All these questions about my well-being when she was the one lying in a hospital bed fighting for her life. I didn't tell her what I had overheard because what good would it have done except make her feel bad about something that wasn't her fault, so instead I helped her sit up slightly, adjusted her pillows, poured fresh water into the cup on her bedside table, and told her that everything was fine, I was just tired, which was true enough even if it wasn't the whole truth. Over the next few days, I started noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before, the way certain nurses would enter my mother's room with a particular expression of resigned sadness, how they would speak a little slower and louder as if she were hard of hearing or cognitively impaired, which she was neither, and how they seemed almost surprised when I showed up each morning with fresh flowers or magazines or the specific brand of lip balm my mother preferred because the hospital air was so dry it made her lips crack and bleed. I realized that despite my constant presence, despite my name being listed as her emergency contact and next of kin, despite all the paperwork I had filled out and conversations I had had with medical staff, somewhere along the way the narrative had been established that my mother was alone, and once that narrative takes hold in a hospital system, it becomes incredibly difficult to dislodge. I started documenting everything, not because I planned to sue anyone or file complaints, but because I needed to understand how this misperception had formed and perpetuated, and what I discovered was a series of small miscommunications and assumptions that had snowballed into something larger. A nurse had noted in the chart that the patient reported her children were far away, which was technically true for Marcus and Janet, but left out the rather crucial detail that I was local and present, and another notation mentioned that the patient seemed depressed about lack of visitors during certain hours, failing to account for the fact that I had to occasionally leave to handle work emergencies or basic life necessities like eating and sleeping. These small notes, written with good intentions by overworked staff members who were doing their best under impossible circumstances, had created a picture of my mother that was fundamentally inaccurate, and that inaccurate picture had influenced how she was treated, not in terms of medical care necessarily, but in terms of the intangible things that make recovery bearable, the sense that someone cares, that you're not just another case number, that your comfort and dignity matter to the people responsible for your well-being. I watched as nurses would rush through their checks with my mother, but linger longer with patients whose rooms were filled with family members and flower arrangements and balloons that proclaimed love and speedy recovery in cheerful fonts, and I understood with a clarity that felt like a punch to the gut that healthcare, for all its scientific precision and technological advancement, was still deeply influenced by social perception and the visible markers of whether someone was valued. The turning point came during a care conference that had been scheduled to discuss my mother's treatment plan and discharge options, and I arrived 10 minutes early because I wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything important, and I sat in the small conference room with its round table and uncomfortable chairs and a whiteboard covered in medical terminology that might as well have been hieroglyphics for all I could decipher. Dr. Harrison arrived with his usual entourage, along with a social worker I hadn't met before, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a tablet that she consulted frequently, and they all seemed slightly surprised to see me sitting there, as if they had expected the meeting to proceed without family involvement. Dr. Harrison started by reviewing my mother's medical status, explaining that while she had survived the surgery and the subsequent complications, her recovery was going to be long and challenging, requiring extensive rehabilitation and ongoing monitoring for cancer recurrence, and then he pivoted to what he called the social aspects of care, which is when the social worker took over and began discussing placement options. She mentioned several skilled nursing facilities in the area, talking about their amenities and staff ratios and rehabilitation programs with the practiced ease of someone who has given this speech hundreds of times, and I let her finish before I asked the question that had been burning in my mind since the beginning of this meeting, which was why we were discussing nursing facilities when I had already made it clear that my mother would be coming home with me. There was a moment of confused silence, the kind where you can see people mentally flipping through files and trying to reconcile what they thought they knew with what they're being told, and the social worker glanced at Dr. Harrison with an expression that clearly said she had not been informed of this particular detail. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat and said something about having understood that I was the patient's daughter, but that he was under the impression I lived out of state, to which I replied that no, I lived approximately 15 minutes away and had been at the hospital every single day since my mother's admission, and surely that information was in the chart because I had provided it during intake. The social worker started scrolling through her tablet more frantically, and one of the residents excused himself from the room for reasons that were never explained, and I sat there feeling this strange mixture of vindication and fury, because here was proof that my presence had been systematically overlooked or discounted, that despite everything I had done, some fundamental communication failure had occurred that painted my mother as isolated and without support. Dr. Harrison recovered his composure quickly, as skilled physicians tend to do, and pivoted to discussing the logistics of home care, suddenly very interested in whether I had the resources and time to provide adequate support, whether my home was suitable for someone with limited mobility, whether I understood the gravity of the commitment I was making. I answered each question calmly and thoroughly, explaining that I worked remotely, which gave me flexibility, that my apartment was on the ground floor with no stairs, that I had already researched home health services and had the contact information for 3 highly rated agencies, that I had spoken with my employer about taking FMLA leave if necessary, and that my mother had raised me to understand that family took care of family, full stop, end of discussion. I watched Dr. Harrison's face as I spoke, seeing the subtle shifts in his expression as he recalibrated his understanding of the situation, and I knew that he was realizing, perhaps for the first time, that his assumptions had been wrong and that those wrong assumptions had colored his entire approach to my mother's care. The meeting concluded with a completely different tone than it had begun, suddenly filled with discussions of discharge timelines and prescription protocols and follow-up appointments, and the social worker promised to send me a comprehensive packet of resources for home caregivers. And Dr. Harrison even made what I think was supposed to be a conciliatory comment about how fortunate my mother was to have such a dedicated daughter, which I accepted with a tight smile that didn't quite reach my eyes because I was still processing the anger and hurt of having been invisible for so long. After they left, I sat alone in that conference room for several minutes, staring at the whiteboard and its incomprehensible medical shorthand, and I let myself feel everything I had been holding back, the exhaustion and frustration and deep sadness that my mother's suffering had been compounded by a system that had failed to see what was right in front of it. When I returned to my mother's room, she was picking at the lunch that had been delivered, some kind of pureed chicken situation that looked deeply unappetizing, and I took the fork from her hand and told her that I had news, that she was coming home with me as soon as the doctors cleared her, that we would set up the second bedroom with everything she needed, that I would take care of her the way she had taken care of me countless times throughout my life.